So for Module 4, Activity 2, Modifying Classroom Management Strategies, I watched the virtual class by Michael Kelly. It was a middle school virtual class. And I'll go over some of the InTASK standards I saw and some of the strategies I saw. So some of the InTASK standards that stood out to me was Standard 1, Learner Development, Standard 2, Learning Differences, and Standard 3, Learning Environments. They're all in the same grouping, learners and learning. Also, Standard 9, Professional Learning and Ethical Practices, and Standard 10, Leadership and Collaboration. I thought these 5 standards were the ones that were highlighted the most in this class. So at the beginning of his virtual class, I noticed that right away the teacher, he greeted many of the students when they came in. They had their cameras on. I thought this was a very good indicator of a good learning environment, Standard 3. He showed professional and ethical practices. He seemed very cordial with the students, but very you could tell he was the one who was the teacher. There was a kid who had potato chips, and I thought it was very clever how he mentioned that we'll have lunch soon. He didn't say don't eat them. He didn't and come at him and almost like authoritarian, but he did highlight it and let it be known that it probably wasn't acceptable in a nice way. I think this shows Standard 10 also, leadership and collaboration. He seemed to mix in so many standards in this one action. He then went over his agenda, which I thought was a great thing to do. I like to go over agenda, lesson objectives, and other things in my classes as well. I think they're very important. He then got into a lesson about himself, which I thought was very interesting. It seemed like the lesson was about his background. A couple of things I was curious about. The class size seemed very small. Even when I taught during COVID, we had smaller classes, but it was still much bigger than this. So I'm curious if this was a private school or if this was students were missing, or I was kind of confused about the class size. Also, I thought it was very interesting how they all came in with their cameras on, but the class itself seemed like the kind of class you would have on the first day of school, where the teacher introduces themselves, their background, their qualifications, and things like that. The students seemed very respectful. They had their cameras on. The teacher did a really good job of not reacting to things in the background. And I think this shows more of Standard 1 and Standard 2, that he understands the emotional and social aspects of the COVID-19 situation and being online. Like when I taught online, you might have a sibling run behind the camera, and I never reacted to it. It never disrupted anything. And I think he showed the same kind of awareness, which I thought was very good. You could definitely tell there was an understanding of differences and diverse communities and things like that. So I thought Standard 2 was also highlighted. I thought this was also highlighted when he had the students go into the breakout rooms to craft a question to ask him about his background and qualifications. I thought that was very interesting. He seemed to have a lot of changing of states of activities, which I think is very important as a teacher. You have to constantly, especially nowadays with so many modern distractions, you have to change states quite often. I was really curious what his Kahoot questions were, and it kind of started the Kahoot, then went right to the end. It said 5 minutes later, so we didn't get to see what the questions were, which I was curious about. Another thing I noted was I wasn't even aware he was a math teacher, except for it was in the title of the video, and then he asked one question about rectangles at the end. So I was curious, have they ever learned about these rectangles before, or is this something that he was just testing their prior knowledge or just trying to test what they know? But I was kind of surprised that that was the only math reference in the whole lesson. If there were some things that I would change, then when he went over, would you rather be an adventurer or a superhero? I would probably say superhero 1, adventurer 2, and then have them all hold up fingers at the same time, just to get a little bit more collaboration. And one other thing about that, when he asked them, he would say, "What do you want to be?" And a student would say, "Superhero." And then he would go right to the next student. I would have probably asked them why. Maybe it was because of time constraints, but I thought it would might have given them a little bit more push to answer the questions. Um, I always like to ask why because it kind of forces them to think a little bit. I'm not saying the way he did it was wrong. It's just a personal preference. Also, when he went over his agenda, I would also go over a lesson objectives. Why are you doing what you're doing? And have maybe one of the students read it. I think that's always good. And then after that, I would give them a chance to answer questions. What are some questions you have about what we're doing today? Which can always, make them feel more involved right at the beginning. Overall, though, I thought his lesson was excellent. I thought it showed a lot of the first three InTASK standards and really highlighted, a good learning environment and how to be a professional teacher and how to diversify your lessons to hit different learners. Because some people learn by sight, some people learn by listening, some people learn by collaboration. And he did a lot of things, like when he asked them to circle how they're feeling, you can get those emotional intrinsic learners, and you can and by having them collaborate in breakout rooms, you get the people that like to work kinesthetically. So I thought he did a lot of good things with that, which I think is really important in a lesson. At my school, they sometimes have me help new teachers in English, and so I always tell them you want to hit 3 to 5 of those every lesson, and if you can, you're going to have a much better retention rate of memorization and things like that. But anyway, thank you for listening.